The world often believes that danger ends the moment disaster is avoided, that once the edge is passed and catastrophe no longer seems inevitable, life simply returns to normal, as if survival alone were enough to erase the risks that brought humanity so close to collapse in the first place. Yet history tells us something far more unsettling. Again and again, it shows that the most dangerous moment is rarely the crisis itself, but the quiet, confident period that follows, when fear fades, vigilance weakens, and the lessons of near disaster begin to dissolve into comfortable assumptions. When catastrophe is narrowly avoided, humanity rarely pauses to reflect with honesty or restraint. Instead, it often replaces caution with confidence, humility with ambition, and self-examination with the comforting belief that the danger was never truly real. It is in this fragile aftermath that leaders grow bolder, nations begin to feel untouchable, and systems that should have been questioned or dismantled are instead strengthened and expanded. Not because they are safe, but because they survived. The calm that follows the storm is not peace, but a pause, and history has repeatedly shown that pauses are deceptive, offering the illusion of stability while silently preparing the conditions for something far more destructive to emerge. Across centuries, civilizations have misunderstood this silence, mistaking survival for strength, luck for superiority, and temporary balance for lasting control, only to discover, often too late, that history does not reward those assumptions, but punishes them with remarkable consistency. The aftermath of avoided disaster has proven, time and again, to be the most vulnerable phase of all, when unresolved tensions resurface under new names, when fear hardens into ideology, and when the very mechanisms designed to prevent catastrophe slowly transform into the instruments that enable it. The world continues forward, but it does so blindly, driven not by wisdom, but by the human desire for normality, a desire so powerful that societies rush back to familiar routines, rebuild the same structures, trust the same systems, and empower the same forces, all while hoping, without evidence, that the outcome will somehow be different this time. What makes this moment truly dangerous is not panic or chaos, but confidence, the quiet certainty that the worst has already passed, that lessons were learned, and that history will not repeat itself again. Yet history is filled with moments when everything could have changed, moments when humanity stood at the edge, stared into the abyss, and chose to step back, only to return later with greater speed, deeper conviction, and far less caution. This is the paradox of survival. Avoiding disaster does not necessarily make us safer. More often, it makes us careless. And it is within this carelessness, this false sense of victory, that the foundations of the next catastrophe are quietly laid. Tonight, we explore one of those moments, a point in history where disaster was avoided, but the world that emerged afterward became far more dangerous than the one that nearly collapsed, reminding us that sometimes the greatest threat is not what almost happened, but what followed. When the crisis finally came to an end, the world did not erupt in celebration or relief, nor did it mark the moment with triumph or victory, but instead slipped into a deep and unsettling silence, as though humanity itself needed time to understand that the worst had truly passed. It was not the peaceful silence of safety or gratitude, but a heavy stillness shaped by exhaustion, disbelief, and the emotional weight of having stood so close to the edge of irreversible disaster. People did not cheer because cheering would have required certainty, and certainty was the one thing no one possessed in those early moments, when survival felt less like a victory and more like a narrow escape that could easily have gone the other way. Across nations and communities, the aftermath unfolded not as a return to normal life, but as a collective pause, a moment where time seemed suspended while the world struggled to process what had nearly occurred and what it had managed by chance or restraint to avoid. Cities continued to function, governments remained in place, and daily routines slowly resumed. Yet beneath the surface there lingered a quiet awareness that something fundamental had changed, even if no one yet knew how to name it. The silence that followed the crisis was filled with unspoken questions rather than answers. Questions about responsibility, vulnerability, and whether the systems that had brought the world so close to collapse could truly be trusted to prevent it from happening again. For many, the exhaustion was not only physical, but psychological, born from weeks or months of sustained tension, uncertainty, and fear, all of which had drained societies of their emotional reserves and left them too weary to reflect with clarity. Disbelief, too, played its role, as people struggled to accept that such a catastrophic outcome had been narrowly avoided, finding it easier to move forward than to confront how fragile the situation had truly been. In this atmosphere, silence became a form of self-protection, a way for individuals and nations alike to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths, choosing instead to rest in the illusion that survival alone was enough to guarantee safety. But history suggests that this silence was never neutral. It was a warning disguised as calm, a fragile moment where the future remained undecided, and where the choices made, or deliberately avoided, would shape everything that followed. Because silence after a crisis does not mean danger has disappeared. It often means it has merely changed its form, retreating from view while waiting for the conditions to return. And it is in this quiet aftermath, when vigilance fades and fatigue takes hold, that the foundations of the next great turning point are quietly laid, unnoticed by a world eager to believe that the worst is already behind it. No cities were reduced to rubble, no streets were buried beneath debris, and no missiles ever crossed the sky. Yet despite the absence of visible destruction, the world that emerged after the crisis was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before it. Life appeared to continue uninterrupted. Buildings stood where they always had, borders remained fixed, and governments maintained the appearance of control, creating the comforting illusion that stability had survived intact. But beneath this familiar surface, a quiet and irreversible transformation had already begun. This time, the damage was not written into the landscape or etched into concrete and steel, but into perception itself, altering how societies understood danger, power, and the limits of control without leaving behind any physical evidence of loss. History reminds us that its most consequential changes do not always arrive through fire or force, but often through moments of restraint that later justify profound shifts in behavior, policy, and belief, shifts that seem reasonable precisely because nothing was destroyed. In the absence of ruins, many concluded that the world had passed its test, that rational decision-making had prevailed, and that humanity had proven capable of stepping back from catastrophe without paying a lasting price. Yet this conclusion ignored a deeper truth. What truly changed was not the structure of cities or the shape of nations, but the mindset through which the future would now be approached, as fear quietly replaced reflection and caution transformed into permanent doctrine. Security, once framed as a temporary necessity, became a defining principle, reshaping institutions and expanding authority under the justification that survival demanded vigilance without limits. Decisions that would once have been questioned, debated, or resisted were now accepted with little hesitation, precisely because there were no ruins to mourn and no visible victims to defend. The lack of destruction created a dangerous narrative, one in which nothing essential appeared to have been lost, allowing societies to move forward without examining what had subtly been surrendered along the way. As a result, new boundaries began to form, not on maps or treaties, but within the collective mindset, as suspicion gradually replaced trust and precaution hardened into ideology. International relationships adapted to this new reality, cooperation giving way to calculation, diplomacy yielding to deterrence, and long-term stability being sacrificed for the promise of immediate control. Power itself was redefined, no longer measured solely by military strength or visible force, but by preparedness, influence, and the ability to anticipate threats before they could ever be confirmed. The world changed quietly, without collapse or reconstruction, reshaped not by devastation, but by decisions made in the shadow of what might have happened. And history warns us that changes made without destruction are often the most enduring, because they provoke little resistance and leave behind few reminders of what was exchanged in the process. What emerged from the crisis was not a broken world struggling to rebuild, but an altered one, confidently moving forward while unaware of how deeply its foundations had already shifted. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe history is shaped as much by what didn't happen as by what did, consider subscribing. This channel explores the moments where the world stood on the edge and stepped back. When the crisis passed without visible destruction, it left behind no ruins to clear, no cities to rebuild, and no physical reminders of what had almost occurred. Yet leaders, soldiers, and civilians alike carried something far more enduring. An invisible weight formed by the knowledge of how close everything had come to ending. This knowledge did not announce itself loudly, nor did it demand attention, but it settled quietly into the minds of those who had witnessed the moment, shaping their thoughts, decisions, and fears long after the immediate danger had faded. For leaders, the experience left a permanent mark, a realization that the systems they commanded had nearly failed, that a single miscalculation, a delayed response, or an unchecked escalation could have erased entire nations in moments, and that this responsibility would never truly leave them. Every decision made afterward carried the shadow of that awareness, influencing choices not only through logic or strategy, but through an unspoken fear of repeating the same near-fatal path. For soldiers, the scars were different but no less profound, forged in the tension of waiting rather than the chaos of battle, in the knowledge that their lives and countless others had depended not on courage or sacrifice, but on restraint and decisions made far beyond their control. They returned not with stories of combat, but with memories of uncertainty, of standing ready for an end that never came, and of realizing how powerless even the most prepared can be when history balances on a single moment. Civilians, too, were changed in ways that were difficult to articulate as daily life resumed and routines returned. Yet beneath the surface lingered an awareness that the world they trusted had come dangerously close to collapsing without warning. This awareness manifested quietly in heightened anxiety, in mistrust of institutions, and in a lingering sense that safety was conditional, temporary, and dependent on forces beyond individual influence. Unlike physical wounds, these psychological scars could not be pointed to or treated directly, making them easier to ignore and far more difficult to heal, even as they shape behavior on a massive scale. Entire societies absorb the trauma without ever naming it, normalizing fear, accepting constant vigilance, and slowly adjusting to a world where the possibility of sudden catastrophe felt uncomfortably real. Over time, this shared psychological burden influenced culture, politics, and public discourse. As caution was praised, suspicion was encouraged, and decisive force was increasingly viewed as a necessary safeguard rather than a last resort. What made these scars especially dangerous was their invisibility, as they justified actions and policies that might otherwise have faced resistance, all while being framed as rational responses to a threat that had narrowly been avoided. The memory of how close everything came to ending became a silent reference point, shaping decisions not through reasoned debate, but through fear of what might happen if restraint failed again. History shows that when societies carry unaddressed psychological trauma, it does not fade with time, but hardens, influencing generations who did not witness the original crisis, but inherit its anxieties nonetheless. In this way, the crisis continued long after it officially ended, not through explosions or destruction, but through the invisible scars left on the collective mind. Scars that quietly guided the world toward choices shaped more by fear than understanding. And it is within these psychological scars, left untreated and rarely acknowledged, that the groundwork for future conflicts is often laid, as the memory of near ending becomes a justification for actions that move the world closer to the very outcome it once managed to avoid. When the crisis passed, many assumed that the danger had been neutralized, that the mechanisms capable of ending the world had been dismantled, deactivated, or rendered harmless by the simple fact that they had not been used. But the weapons were never dismantled. The systems were never truly shut down. They simply waited. Hidden behind protocols, safeguards, and layers of authorization, the machinery of destruction remained intact, preserved not as relics of a dark possibility, but as active instruments justified by deterrence and necessity. In the aftermath, these systems were not questioned with urgency, nor were they treated as failures narrowly avoided, but instead reframed as proof of balance, restraint, and control, reinforcing the belief that their continued existence was what had prevented catastrophe in the first place. Missiles remained fueled, command centers stayed operational, and early warning networks continued their silent vigilance, scanning the horizon for threats that might never come, yet always preparing for the moment they might. What made these systems especially dangerous was not their power, but their persistence. They did not sleep, they did not forget, and they did not reflect. They existed in a constant state of readiness, designed to respond within minutes or seconds to signals that could be misread, misunderstood, or triggered by human error. As time passed, familiarity replaced fear. What had once inspired anxiety became routine, and what had nearly ended everything slowly faded into the background of everyday governance, handled by specialists, algorithms, and procedures few fully understood. This normalization created an illusion of safety, as the very systems capable of irreversible destruction were treated as stable, manageable, and ultimately controllable. Yet history teaches us that no system remains flawless indefinitely. Technology ages, assumptions become outdated, and safeguards designed for one era are forced to operate in another, while human judgment remains as vulnerable as ever to pressure, fatigue, and miscalculation. Despite this, dismantling these systems was never seriously pursued, because doing so would have required confronting uncomfortable truths about trust, vulnerability, and the thin margins separating deterrence from disaster. Instead, the world chose continuity. The weapons stayed in place, the systems stayed active, and readiness became a permanent condition rather than a temporary response. In this state of constant preparedness, the line between prevention and provocation blurred, as each side measured safety not by reducing risk, but by maintaining the ability to respond faster, strike harder, and appear more resolute than the other. This logic ensured that while catastrophe had been avoided, it was never truly removed from the equation. It merely became dormant, waiting within networks, codes, and command chains that were never designed to question their own existence. The greatest danger was not that these systems might be used deliberately, but that they might one day be activated accidentally, through error, misinterpretation, or the false certainty that control had already been proven. And so the world moved forward under the quiet presence of systems that never slept, trusting that vigilance alone would be enough to prevent the very outcome their existence continued to make possible. History warns us that this trust is fragile, because systems designed to end the world do not need intent to succeed, only the absence of doubt at the wrong moment. As time passed, the world gradually returned to routine, guided by the comforting belief that danger had been left behind and that the crisis belonged safely to the past, remembered as a moment that ended without consequence rather than as a warning that demanded lasting change. Daily life resumed its familiar rhythm, economies stabilized, political conversations shifted forward, and societies embraced normality, not because it had been proven safe, but because it offered relief from fear and uncertainty. Routine became reassurance, and normality slowly transformed into evidence, allowing survival itself to be mistaken for security, even though nothing fundamental had been removed from the conditions that made the crisis possible. In this new reality, safety was never a certainty, but an assumption, an idea built not on the elimination of danger, but on the hope that it would not return. The absence of catastrophe was interpreted as proof of control, reinforcing the belief that systems had functioned correctly. Decisions had been sound, and humanity had demonstrated its ability to manage even the most extreme threats. Yet history reminds us that safety is not defined by what did not happen, but by what can no longer happen. And in this case, nothing had truly been taken off the table. The weapons remained in place, the systems stayed active, and the psychological scars endured beneath the surface, quietly shaping behavior while attention drifted elsewhere. What changed most was perception, as weeks turned into months and months into years, and the memory of how close everything came to ending softened under the weight of routine and repetition. This gradual fading made it easier for societies to grow comfortable within conditions that were never meant to be permanent, shifting focus away from prevention and toward maintenance. away from questioning and toward acceptance. Confidence grew, not the kind rooted in understanding, but the kind born from familiarity, the confidence that restraint would always prevail, that control once demonstrated would never fail, and that vigilance could be sustained indefinitely. But safety built on confidence alone is fragile, because it depends on flawless judgment, perfect systems, and uninterrupted attention, all of which history has shown to be impossible to maintain over time. As the illusion of safety settled in, risks were normalized, extraordinary measures became ordinary, and constant preparedness faded into the background of everyday life, no longer questioned because it no longer felt urgent. What was once understood as temporary hardened into permanence, and what was once feared became familiar enough to ignore, creating an environment where warning signs were easier to dismiss and near misses were reframed as proof of resilience rather than signals of vulnerability. The world did not become safer during this period. It became accustomed to danger, adapting to its presence instead of working to remove it. And in that adaptation lay the greatest risk, because the more stable things appeared on the surface, the less prepared societies became to question the foundations of that stability. The illusion of safety did not announce itself as a mistake. It arrived quietly, disguised as progress, calm, and normality, encouraging the belief that as long as nothing went wrong, nothing truly needed to change. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe history is shaped as much by what didn't happen as by what did, consider subscribing. This channel explores the moments where the world stood on the edge and stepped back. In the aftermath of the crisis, the world moved quickly to demonstrate that lessons had been learned, drafting new rules, revising protocols, and constructing fresh lines of communication designed to ensure that such a moment would never again come so close to ending everything. Committees were formed, agreements were signed, and safeguards were reinforced, creating the appearance of progress and responsibility, as though structure alone could compensate for how narrowly disaster had been avoided. On paper, the world looked safer. Procedures were clearer, chains of command more defined, and communication channels faster and more direct, all intended to reduce uncertainty and eliminate the misunderstandings that had once pushed events toward the brink. These changes mattered, and they were not meaningless, but they addressed only part of the problem, focusing on systems and processes while quietly assuming that the people operating them would behave differently when the pressure returned. What was overlooked was not a lack of information or coordination, but the deeper forces that had always shaped human decision-making: fear, pride, mistrust, and the instinct to protect power even at great risk. Human nature did not change. It adapted. The same impulses that had driven escalation before were now operating within updated frameworks, guided by new rules, but still influenced by old instincts, old rivalries, and old assumptions about strength and weakness. New communication lines reduced the chance of silence, but they did not eliminate misunderstanding, because words spoken in moments of tension are still filtered through bias, urgency, and fear. Rules created boundaries, but they could not remove ambition, nor could they erase the desire to appear resolute, decisive, and in control, especially when leaders felt watched, judged, or challenged. In moments of calm, these safeguards inspired confidence, reinforcing the belief that the world had grown wiser and more capable of managing its most dangerous tools. But history shows that true tests do not arrive during calm. They arrive when time is limited, information is incomplete, and consequences feel immediate, conditions under which even the most carefully designed systems are vulnerable to the same human flaws that have shaped conflict for centuries. Half-learned lessons are dangerous precisely because they feel complete. They create the sense that a problem has been solved, encouraging complacency while leaving the core risk intact, hidden beneath layers of procedure and protocol. The world learned how to communicate faster, but not how to trust more deeply. It learned how to respond more efficiently, but not how to resist the instinct to escalate. And it learned how to manage crises without fully addressing why those crises came so close to spiraling out of control in the first place. As a result, the safeguards built after the crisis did not remove danger. They merely reorganized it, embedding it more deeply into systems that appeared rational, modern, and secure. This gave rise to a fragile confidence, one rooted not in understanding human limits, but in believing that structure could override instinct. History suggests otherwise. Again and again, it shows that when lessons are only partially learned, the conditions for repetition are preserved, waiting for a moment when pressure exposes the same vulnerabilities beneath a more sophisticated surface. In this sense, the crisis did not end with resolution, but with postponement, as the world convinced itself that improvement was enough, without confronting the uncomfortable reality that the greatest risk had never been technical, but human. With time, the crisis faded into history, gradually losing its immediacy as headlines disappeared. Attention shifted elsewhere, and new events claimed the world's focus, transforming what had once felt urgent into something distant and abstract. It became a reference point rather than a lived experience, something discussed in reports, timelines, and retrospectives, stripped of the fear and tension that had once defined it. Yet history did not forget. It remembered quietly, not as a triumph and not as a moment of success, but as a warning preserved beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed by those willing to look beyond outcomes and into causes. There were no monuments built to celebrate it, no anniversaries widely marked, and no collective sense of victory to define its place in memory, because nothing had truly been resolved. What survived was not a lesson loudly proclaimed, but a subtle reminder of fragility, embedded in archives, testimonies, and decisions that followed. In this way, the crisis became part of a pattern rather than an exception. Another instance where the world approached the edge, stepped back, and then continued forward without fully understanding what had nearly happened. The absence of destruction made it easier to reframe the moment as manageable, controllable, and ultimately successful, allowing societies to remember restraint rather than risk, and outcome rather than process. But history is shaped less by what is celebrated than by what is quietly recorded. And what it recorded here was not victory, but proximity. Proximity to collapse. Proximity to irreversible consequence. Proximity to decisions that could not have been undone. This quiet warning lingered in the background, influencing policy debates, strategic thinking, and institutional memory, even as it was rarely acknowledged openly. It shaped how future crises were interpreted, how risks were assessed, and how confidence was justified, often without explicit reference to the moment itself. Because warnings that arrive without catastrophe are easy to misinterpret. They lack the clarity of failure and the urgency of loss, making them easy to downplay or dismiss as overreactions in hindsight. Yet history treats these moments with particular seriousness, precisely because they reveal how close systems can come to breaking without actually doing so. They expose weaknesses without forcing correction, they reveal danger without demanding change, and they leave behind a choice: to treat the moment as confirmation that everything worked, or to recognize it as evidence that everything almost failed. The quiet warning embedded in this crisis was not meant to inspire fear, but awareness, not panic, but humility, and not confidence, but restraint. However, awareness fades when not reinforced, humility erodes when not practiced, and restraint weakens when success is assumed rather than questioned. As generations pass, the memory becomes thinner, more symbolic than real, while the structures and instincts that produced the crisis remain largely intact. History remembers this not with noise, but with silence, cataloging it among other moments when humanity was spared not because it was prepared, but because circumstances allowed it. And in that silence lies the warning, a reminder that what did not happen matters just as much as what did, and that survival without understanding is not resolution, but delay. Because history does not repeat itself through spectacle alone. It repeats itself through forgotten warnings. In the end, the world survived, and from a distance, that survival was easy to interpret as success, as proof that restraint had prevailed and that catastrophe had been narrowly but confidently avoided. Yet this interpretation is comforting rather than accurate. The world did not endure because it was fully prepared, nor because every safeguard functioned as intended, nor because humanity had truly mastered the forces it had placed at the center of its own survival, but because circumstances aligned just enough to prevent irreversible consequences. Survival in this moment was not the product of certainty or control, but of chance operating quietly in the background, compensating for hesitation, misjudgment, and vulnerabilities that were never fully understood. Luck stepped in where preparation fell short, where information was incomplete, and where decisions were made under pressure rather than clarity, ensuring that mistakes did not escalate beyond the point of return. Because nothing collapsed and no final line was crossed, this luck was gradually reinterpreted as competence, reinforcing the belief that the world had proven itself capable of managing its most dangerous systems without consequence. But history tells us that luck is not evidence of readiness. It is the absence of immediate failure, nothing more. Luck cannot be measured, refined, or relied upon. Because it offers no consistency and no protection against repetition, only temporary relief from outcomes that remain possible. When survival is mistaken for preparedness, the conditions that nearly cause disaster are allowed to persist, unchanged and unquestioned, hidden beneath confidence and reinforced by routine. This is where the real danger lies, not in the existence of weapons alone, nor in the continued operation of complex systems, but in the belief that success was earned rather than borrowed. Luck does not correct flawed assumptions. It does not strengthen judgment. It does not alter human nature. It simply delays consequences. And when luck eventually runs out, as history shows it always does, the same structures remain in place, the same instincts guide decisions, and the same half-learned lessons resurface under pressure. The world often confuses survival with proof of readiness, forgetting that true preparedness requires intention, restraint, and the willingness to dismantle what no longer serves stability, even when doing so feels uncomfortable or risky. Real security is not built on narrow escapes, but on decisions made long before escape becomes necessary, decisions rooted in humility rather than confidence, and in understanding rather than assumption. The crisis that almost ended everything did not deliver a victory, and it did not resolve the dangers it exposed. It delivered a warning that avoiding catastrophe once does not make it less likely the next time, and that the absence of destruction is not evidence of safety, only proof that chance intervened. In the end, history will not measure this moment by the fact that humanity survived. It will measure it by what was learned, what was changed, and whether the world understood that survival granted by luck is not protection, but postponement. Because luck is not a strategy, and no world can rely on it forever. History is not shaped only by what is done, it is shaped by what is stopped. And sometimes the future of the world depends on the courage to say nothing and wait.